40,000 Ottoman soldiers surrounded a crumbling Hungarian fortress in the autumn of 1552, and inside its walls, fewer than 2,000 men, women, and priests prepared to die. This is the Siege of Eger, one of the most stunning military upsets in European history. A battle so lopsided in numbers that professional military strategists of the era dismissed the defenders outright. The Ottoman Empire had never lost a prolonged siege. Not once. And yet, on the rolling hills of northern Hungary, in a fortress that military engineers had already written off as indefensible, the impossible happened. To understand what the Siege of Eger meant in 1552, you need to understand the world it happened in. The Ottoman Empire at this point was not simply a powerful nation. It was a force of nature. Under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire had swallowed up the Balkans, crushed the Kingdom of Hungary at the catastrophic Battle of Mohacs in 1526, and pushed its armies to the very gates of Vienna. The Ottomans were the dominant military power of the age, better equipped, better organized, and far more experienced in siege warfare than any European force they had yet faced. They were, by every measurable standard, unbeatable. If you love epic historical stories about courage, heroism, and battles that defied the odds, make sure to subscribe to Epic Battles, hit that like button, and leave a comment below. Drop Eger holds, or tell me what you think about this legendary defense. Your likes and comments really help the channel grow and bring more incredible stories like this to life. Hungary, once a proud kingdom stretching across the heart of Central Europe, had been shattered into pieces. The southern and central portions were now an Ottoman province. A thin strip of western land survived under Habsburg control, and caught in a dangerous buffer zone between them lay a series of fortresses that served as the last meaningful line of resistance. If those fortresses fell, the road to Vienna, and beyond, lay open. Eger was one of those fortresses. It sat in the Matra highlands of northern Hungary, a modest town anchored by a castle perched on volcanic rock above the Eger River valley. The walls were old, patched, and in places structurally compromised. Military engineers who inspected it before the siege considered it barely adequate. The garrison inside numbered roughly 2,100 soldiers at the start of the campaign, supplemented by several hundred armed civilians. To put that in perspective, 2,100 people is roughly the population of a small village. The Ottoman force assembling outside the walls numbered between 35,000 and 40,000 soldiers, more than the entire population of London at the time, along with a massive siege train of artillery that had reduced far more formidable fortresses to rubble in previous campaigns. The ratio was approximately 20-1. The man chosen to defend this apparently hopeless position was István Dobó, a Hungarian nobleman and career military officer. Dobó was a hardened, methodical commander in his mid-40s who had spent years managing border fortresses through chronic shortages of men and money. He knew exactly what he was facing. He also knew exactly what it meant to abandon Eger without a fight. If the fortress fell without resistance, the psychological collapse of the remaining Hungarian territories could follow. So Dobó made the decision that history would remember for centuries. He chose to fight. In the weeks before the Ottoman army arrived, Dobó drove his garrison relentlessly. He stockpiled food, ammunition, and gunpowder. He repaired the most vulnerable wall sections as best he could. He drilled soldiers and organized the armed civilians into support roles, carrying ammunition, patching breaches, hauling water to extinguish fires from incendiary projectiles. Women, older townspeople, even clergy were assigned active roles. Priests carried stones to the walls. Women boiled water and tar. Blacksmiths forged weapons and repaired equipment around the clock. Eger was not simply a military garrison preparing for a siege. It was an entire community preparing to fight for its survival. The Ottoman commanders who arrived in mid-September 1552, Kadim Ali Pasha and Ahmed Pasha, two experienced veterans of dozens of campaigns, surveyed the small fortress with something close to contempt. They had seen stronger walls than these crumble within days. They brought their guns into position and opened fire with calm, professional confidence. The cannon they deployed against Eger were not small field pieces. These were massive, specialized siege guns capable of hurling stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, capable of pulverizing masonry that had stood for generations. When they opened fire, the sound traveled for miles. The walls of Eger shuddered. Sections of parapet collapsed. Dust and debris rose in thick clouds over the fortress. and Dobó. Its repair crews moved forward before the dust had even settled. During the night, while Ottoman guns fell silent, Hungarian soldiers and civilians worked by torchlight, hauling timber, stone, and packed earth to plug every breach. Each morning when the Ottoman gunners returned to their positions, they found the walls patched, not perfectly, not as strong as before, but functional. That stubborn repair effort was something the Ottoman commanders had not planned for. It was not the behavior of men who believed they were about to lose. The first major assault came when the Ottomans judged the bombardment had created sufficient breaches. Thousands of soldiers moved forward in organized waves, armed with scaling ladders, hooks, and hand weapons. They crossed the open ground under covering fire from archers and musketeers. The defenders met them with everything they had. Burning pitch and boiling water poured from the walls onto the men climbing below. Stones the size of a man, his head rained down. Arquebuses fired at point-blank range into the faces of soldiers appearing at the tops of ladders. Where breaches had opened, the fighting collapsed into brutal close-quarters combat, men hacking at each other in narrow gaps in the rubble, with no room for strategy and no mercy given. At several points during the early assaults, the Ottoman soldiers very nearly broke through. The wall sections near the outer gate were overrun briefly. Dobó himself led counterattacks with reserve troops, fighting in the rubble alongside his men. The women of the fortress moved through this chaos carrying water and ammunition. When Ottoman soldiers forced a breach near the old tower, it was reportedly women armed with improvised tools who helped push back the assault while soldiers repositioned. These were not trained warriors. They were ordinary people running on pure adrenaline, understanding that if those walls were taken and held, everything inside was gone. One of the most dangerous moments of the entire siege came when Ottoman engineers began tunneling beneath the fortress foundations. The plan was to pack the tunnels with gunpowder and collapse the walls from below, a technique called sapping that had proven devastatingly effective in other sieges across Europe and the Middle East. If it worked at Eger, no amount of brave fighting above ground would matter. Dobó, his men detected the tunneling through vibrations in the ground and through careful observation of disturbed earth beyond the walls. They began counter-mining, digging their own tunnels to intercept the Ottoman excavations before they could be packed with powder. Underground, in narrow earthen passages lit only by small oil lamps, Hungarian soldiers met Ottoman diggers in combat so close that swords were useless. Men fought with daggers in complete darkness, in tunnels barely wide enough for a single person, with tons of earth pressing down from above and no sound to guide them except breathing and scraping and the wet thud of close-range violence. It was some of the most terrifying fighting of the entire siege. A man in a tunnel beneath a fortress has nowhere to retreat. The darkness swallows everything. The enemy can come from any direction. Some counter-mines succeeded in intercepting the Ottoman tunnels before the gunpowder was set. One Ottoman mine succeeded in blowing a breach in the northern wall. The explosion shook the entire fortress like an earthquake, and 30 feet of wall simply ceased to exist. The assault through that breach was the closest the Ottomans came to ending the Siege of Eger on their own terms. Thousands of soldiers rushed the opening, and for a terrible period the outcome of the entire battle hung in the balance. Dobó was wounded. Sources indicate multiple significant wounds during the siege. But he remained on the walls, visible to his men, refusing to withdraw. His presence was a declaration to every person inside that fortress. If the commander is still fighting, then so are we. The breach was sealed not with masonry but with human bodies and improvised barriers of timber and earth. Ottoman soldiers who forced their way through were cut down in savage hand-to-hand combat. The counterattack held, the wall held, and the psychological momentum of the siege began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. Throughout the campaign, Dobó demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of warfare that went beyond simple courage. He authorized night sorties, small groups of soldiers who slipped out of the fortress after dark to attack Ottoman positions, destroy siege equipment, and disrupt supply operations. These raids were enormously dangerous. The men who conducted them operated in the dark inside a camp of tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, guided by nothing except their knowledge of the terrain and their own nerve. But they succeeded repeatedly. Ottoman cannon were spiked, supply caches burned, engineers were interrupted in their work. The raids unsettled the commanders in ways that artillery alone could not explain. An army of 40,000 should not need to worry about raids from 2,000 defenders. The fact that it did, that Hungarian raiders could operate inside the Ottoman perimeter at all, communicated something the Ottomans had not anticipated. These defenders had not accepted defeat. They were not waiting to die. They were fighting to win. The siege stretched through September and deep into October. The weather turned cold and wet. Autumn in the Matra highlands arrives with force. Heavy fog, driving rain, temperatures that turn an open camp into a misery of mud. An army of 40,000 soldiers requires a logistical operation of enormous scale to maintain. That operation had been designed for a siege of days, perhaps 2 weeks at most. As the weeks passed and the walls of Eger continued to stand, Ottoman supply lines strained. Disease, that relentless companion of all siege armies before the age of modern medicine, moved through the Ottoman camp with increasing efficiency. Men who had arrived in September confident and healthy were sick and demoralized by October. The final major assault, the largest coordinated attack of the entire 39-day siege, came in late October. The Ottomans launched simultaneous attacks against multiple wall sections, attempting to spread the defenders thin and create a breakthrough somewhere along the perimeter before reserves could respond. Thousands of soldiers moved forward in columns under covering artillery fire. Every man who could hold a weapon was on the walls. Women ran ammunition at full speed. The wounded who could stand were standing. The sound of the battle, cannon, firearms, screaming men, collapsing masonry, and the flat, horrible noise of bladed weapons in close combat, merged into a single overwhelming roar that stripped away everything except the raw reality of survival. The assault failed. Ottoman soldiers reached the walls at multiple points and were thrown back at every one. When the attack broke, when the momentum of those thousands of men faltered and reversed, it was not a tactical withdrawal. Something deeper had fractured. The soldiers retreating from the walls of Eger in late October 1552 were retreating because the collective will of a vast army had given out. They had done everything correctly. Superior numbers, superior artillery, superior experience. None of it had been enough. The fortress still stood. The Ottoman forces formally abandoned the Siege of Eger on October 18, 1552. After 39 days of continuous fighting, they left behind their dead, sections of their siege equipment, and something more valuable than any physical object: the assumption of invincibility that had preceded every Ottoman campaign into Central Europe for a generation. That assumption was not simply damaged at Eger. It was destroyed. The human cost on both sides was severe. Ottoman casualties numbered in the thousands, enough to send shock across military circles throughout Europe. The defending garrison lost several hundred killed, with the vast majority of survivors carrying wounds of some kind. Dobó, wounded and exhausted, was treated as a national hero almost immediately. The King of Hungary honored him publicly. Poets wrote about the siege within months of its conclusion. The story of Eger spread quickly across the continent through letters, dispatches, and early printed news sheets, arriving in courts and capitals as proof of something that military analysts had begun to doubt. The Ottoman advance was not inevitable. Walls, will, and ordinary people prepared to pay any price could stop a force that had seemed unstoppable. The long-term consequences were significant. The northern Hungarian territories remained out of Ottoman hands for decades after the siege, partly because Eger had demonstrated they could be defended. The fortress was reinforced and strengthened in the years that followed. The psychological effect on both sides of the conflict was impossible to fully measure but impossible to ignore. An empire built in part on the fear of its own invincibility had met a garrison of 2,000 soldiers and civilians and had been turned back. In Hungarian national memory, the Siege of Eger became something that transcends military history. It became the defining story of who Hungarians understood themselves to be, a people who did not simply accept the verdict of overwhelming force, who found in the shared work of survival a unity that peacetime could never quite produce. Soldiers, priests, blacksmiths, and women carrying water up stone steps through an artillery bombardment, all of them equal in that moment, all of them the wall. The Ottoman Empire would besiege Eger again in 1596, and that time the fortress would fall. History is rarely kind enough to let any act of defiance stand forever. But the memory of 1552 has proven impossible to erase. Nearly 5 centuries later, the Siege of Eger remains one of the most studied examples in all of military history of what determined people can accomplish against overwhelming odds. A reminder that the outcome of any battle, no matter how lopsided the numbers appear on paper, is ultimately decided not by arithmetic, but by the one thing arithmetic has never learned to measure: the absolute refusal of human beings to believe they have already lost. If you love epic historical stories about unbreakable courage, defiance against impossible odds, and battles that change the course of history, then hit that subscribe button right now on Epic Battles. Every new video takes you deep into legendary events that don't just inform, they inspire, they stir pride, and they remind us what ordinary people can achieve when they refuse to accept defeat. If this story of Eger moved you, drop a like and leave a comment below with "Eger holds," or tell me which moment of this legendary defense hit you the hardest. Your likes and comments truly help the channel grow and allow me to bring you even more high-quality, breathtaking stories like this one. Subscribe now, because the best is yet to come. Don't miss it.